Welcome at the Abu Dhabi Transparency House, coming to you live from the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week here at the Dutch Pavilion. I have here from Deltares, Ahmed. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting. I'm very honored.
You were willing to share your story about Deltares, so maybe you can introduce Deltares and what you do there.
Deltares is a Dutch research institute, applied research institute. So we develop knowledge and share it, which is applied in the practice. We sit close to the university on one hand and the industry and the application on the other hand. We are mainly based in the Netherlands. About 850 people work for Deltares. The main focus of Deltares is water, subsurface, and the infrastructure that relates to water and the subsurface, so transport infrastructure and water infrastructure. We have been active also in this region for many years. Since the 70s, we have been involved in projects related to, for example, coastal development, coastal management, protection. And now we have a diverse sort of applications where we contribute and work together with local partners. But that was our initial involvement in this region many years ago.
So, a little bit more about Deltares. Is it a normal commercial company with consultants, or how is it structured?
We are what they call a foundation. Under the Dutch law, it's a not-for-profit foundation. We are one of 6 applied research institutes in the Netherlands. Each of them has a different focus. Nearly 50% of our work is actually dedicated to the Dutch government in the terms of advice on different topics. For example, flood risk management. This is one of the main aspects we deal with, also related to infrastructure. Our motto is enabling Delta life, but that's not only deltas around river, but also coastal cities. So things related to challenges around climate change adaptation, flood risk, how to manage this, how to have a holistic approach to deal with these challenges. And we do this for the Netherlands, but also all over the world. So we work worldwide, and we serve governments, we serve industry, we partner with consultants, with contractors. In this regard, we are a research institute and a specialist advisor.
Can you maybe also suggest that with the climate change predictions, that Deltares also has a unique history and knowledge base to make a very big impact on the world?
Deltares has been involved in many of the studies relating to climate change. On the one hand, looking at scenarios, we are not the climate experts, we do have people, but we are not the meteorology office, but we work a lot on the climate predictions and how to actually translate this into risk assessment on the one hand and adaptation on the other hand. One of the main challenges there is that the uncertainty in these predictions is reasonably high, and if you would devise solutions that are geared towards the highest risk, that's a very high investment. What we deliver at the moment and what our colleagues work on is what we call adaptive solutions, which means that you adapt your solution on the way, so you take into account how the uncertainty is developing with time, so how the climate change actually predictions are developing with time.
Can you give me can you give the listeners some examples of how your predictions and your risk analysis work?
Yeah, so it's not my specialty, but in general, you do have a climate, and one part of the climate is a weather prediction, but there are other aspects into it. And once you have these predictions, you can, for example, if you look at roads, and one example of one of the critical infrastructures, as we call it, you can look at if the changes or the predictions would have an impact on these roads in the future. And the future can be a short term or a bit longer term. And these impacts can be emphasized in, for example, if you have a higher temperature or if you have more inundations through rains, if this will lead to some slope instabilities, how it will impact, and this is what we call the risk assessment part. And once you identify this risk, you can also devise or advise on solutions. And these solutions would be then again, in a way, adaptive. So things that has to be done for the acute risks, but things can be adaptive on the longer term. And that's how we, I think, in a way, deal with the climate change and adaptation on a regional scale, but it also can be geared towards a very specific piece of infrastructure.
So Deltares has a very unique position because they are not only financially driven, they are driven from the point of sharing the knowledge that you have. Of course, there's a lot of projects that are used in the Netherlands, where you have, I think it's logically that you have a base of origin there because it's a delta region, hence the name, of course. But what do you think is the foremost product that you see Deltares be delivering? What type of projects in regions such as Abu Dhabi or Middle East in general?
To start with, we do a lot of work outside also to learn from it. So it's not one way. Actually, we develop knowledge in the Netherlands. We share this knowledge outside, but we also learn a lot from the other examples outside, and that keeps us enhancing our knowledge base. So in that regard, we also learn from what we see in other countries, and each country and each region has its own challenges and its own specifics. In this area, we see a lot of developments going on, very rapid developments, which is very good, but it also brings some challenges.
Can you give an example of?
Rapid developments in terms of growth, in terms of population, in terms of economical developments.
Which has an effect on water supply and infrastructure.
So you have indeed on demand on water, on the energy, and at the same time you want to keep it sustainable, and you would like to also take into account the climate challenges. So how can you have a holistic approach to manage all this? To manage the water and the link to energy, to food, like we call the nexus, for example, but also how you can take into account the climate resilience. So that's what we see as a role for us to work with local authorities, local companies, on working out these strategies, for example. We were privileged from the Higher Council in Dubai to do a study on climate adaptation for the city of Dubai in the last 2 years, which is a climate adaptation on a higher level. But we also would like to go into the implementation and working with the local authorities and the companies on implementing these adaptation strategies.
So you're talking about these adaptations. Can you give a very concrete example that people who are listening know, that's something that's been made possible because of the work of Deltares?
We've done projects all over the world. I've been myself involved in a project, for example, in Paraguay. We made a pilot project on 300 kilometers of the road network there, where we advised the Ministry of Transport on how to, in this pilot project, how to tackle climate challenges in the future by providing examples of how to adapt the road network to manage these climate predictions.
So if I'm just making this up, but for instance, there's an area where there's a lot of flooding because of wood chopping or something else.
Yes.
Your road systems cannot handle this water.
Yes.
Then it is your task to define what kind of effects that are possibly there and how to prevent that in the future.
Exactly.
And would the outcome then be a study saying you have to increase the foundations of the road network? Or
for example, yes, and we actually take into account also the socio-economic aspects. So we could come up with different solutions, and we, or together with some local partners, most of the time, we look at the socio-economic aspect and see the most cost-effective and also relevant to the society, and advise the solution. And that's how we indeed can provide advice or do studies on a very local level, but also on a very high level, just adaptation strategy for a city, for example.
And if you talk about adaptation for a city, what would that entail?
That would be a high-level study looking at different sectors, for example, like transport, like water, like energy, and identifying the challenges related to climate change in these sectors, and at the same manner advising adaptation strategies at a higher level for these sectors. But then it has to be further translated to implementation for each sector separately afterwards.
So with the human population growth, there's a lot of cities increasing in size. You can imagine, or I can imagine, that there's a lot more people conglomerating, which put more strain on the resources, but also on the water, drinking water inlet, but also on wastewater, for instance. And then Deltares could think of a plan on how to manage this looking further into the future.
Indeed, that's a very good summary of what we can do, for example, at an urban level, so in the urban planning and in the water management for a city, for a country even, because in the Netherlands, for example, there is a water management, integrated water management for the country. And then it goes down, of course, to the municipalities and the local cities, but there is a very high-level water management plan.
I can imagine that doing such an in-depth study for an entire city or a country or a region, that you have a lot of advice, a lot of things you want, based on the risk assessment, that the customer or the government should embed in their future plans. Do you often feel that these customers actually do enough with the advices you give?
Yeah, I think that in the first place we should admit that the people who ask for our advice are already committed to do something on these aspects. So because if they don't have the awareness and the will to do something, they wouldn't engage into doing such studies. So that's the first sign that actually, yes, there is a lot of awareness and commitment from a lot of different countries, different parts of the world. They are not all the same, but there is definitely awareness. And the ones we work with are usually committed and willing to do more, yes.
I can imagine you also have a lot of competition from companies that can deliver sort of the same technologies or advices. Could you name your main difference between yourselves and these competitors?
I don't know if it's about competition. It's in our position, I think we work a lot with all kinds of levels, from government, as I mentioned, up to consultants and contractors. So we advise and we provide special knowledge, which we have, and we do that willingly and happily, without necessarily competing. Of course, there will be some overlap with others, but usually we complement more than we compete. So I think this is where our sharing of the knowledge and the will to share it and complement others makes us a bit unique in that regard, rather than trying to compete.
I want to make a little step back to my earlier question related to if the customers actually implement that which you supply, because I can imagine you also need to do some sales by your own. So there's some proactive approach towards a region, government or company saying, we've seen in the media, or we've done this in your neighboring country or city. We think this is also very relevant for you. We've already done half of the study, so proactively trying to convince those parties to also implement the advice that you have given.
Yeah.
Is that something you proactively do? Can you make that change go on?
We try. We, as an institute, we don't have a business development titles, let me put it that way, or marketing force behind. But of course, we try to at least let the world, a lot of the people we would like to work with, know what we do. So I have a role here in the region as a Deltares representative in the Gulf countries, for example, to try to bring this knowledge about what we do as much closer as possible to the relevant stakeholders. Luckily, a lot of the the authorities and the companies and the governments here know us because we are here. But of course, still we will do more on as much as we can to try to share our knowledge where it's relevant.
I can also imagine with a global operating company like you have, also with a lot of data that you've built up in the last decennia, you can also maybe predict certain effects that you see in the world. Of course, and I know that you personally are not working on climate change, but I can imagine that you can already see a certain trend. Your risk analysis always go a certain direction. Is there some things that you can see happening in the last decades or maybe in the recent history that you feel that's something we will be seeing more often?
There's a continuous update of the studies we do using the data, especially, yes, it's a data-driven studies, what we do a lot nowadays. I cannot comment on that myself, as you mentioned, it's not my specialty, but there is, we have a lot of references and colleagues who are experts on this. They share their knowledge through different
And talking about your expertise, I mean, you were earlier suggesting water management. Can you give some examples of the trends that you see happening there? Earlier we mentioned cities are increasing in size, so that brings certain complexities.
Yeah.
Or like you said, I think it was Panama, or at least Latin America, I believe you said.
There are different places in Latin America, yeah.
Having to do with infrastructure. Are there certain typical projects that you see the risks are increasing or the demand is rising?
I wouldn't call the risk, I think it's all the challenges. So for example, how you would manage the resources you have, which is, so it's not just about too much water or too little water, but it's also about, for example, how clean is the water. If you have a saline intrusion, for example, if you deplete your wells, how you use energy for your desalination in this region. So I think the challenge is more, and also that is what the Netherlands is promoting for the Expo 2020, uniting water, food and energy. How you have a holistic approach, how to manage the resources, to provide solutions to water management, to energy, and the need for food side, for example. So all these three are interlinked, and that's what I think where we can add value and work together here.
Yeah, it's I think already a very nice closing statement almost, because I can imagine I had discussions here with Red Stack who have energy source through the difference between sweet water and salt water. We have also tomorrow several food-related companies who are very much into generating sustainable food systems with a closed loop, so that you can somewhere in a region where there's less water or where there's less sunlight or a mixture of things where you can produce more. I can imagine that Deltares has a lot of linking pins with all these topics, because there's almost everywhere there's water involved.
Indeed. We also have people working on the energy transition. We do a lot on offshore wind in the Netherlands, for example. And aquathermy is also water from, energy from water. So we work on the interface between water and energy, and of course that is cannot be independent from food, for example. So that's something we do, and we like to do also here in the region.
Yeah, it sounds like you have a very crucial role in connecting all those. Thank you for sharing your story with us. I think, Ahmed, you have made it very clear about what Deltares does, some concrete examples that people or governments that have actual problems, they can relate to. This is something that everybody knows. The Dutch are good at living in and underneath water. So I think you have a very prosperous future ahead of you, and Deltares can profit also from all the changes that are happening exponentially in the world. Thank you for sharing your story, and we'll be talking later again today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And for those listening, we are now on to our final interview, but before that a very short recess, and then we will be talking to Asai with an IT solution regarding document control, as I understand. Maybe something Deltares also uses, but might be also here connecting some people that can do business together. So thank you, and
Thank you.
enjoy your stay and
Thanks
a
a
lot
lot.
of visits.
Thank